The house looked like it had been plucked from another time and put in a busy neighborhood. There were still festive garlands on the streets, even though Christmas was long gone, and the spring chill was starting to tingle. For Nicole and her friends, Laura, Matt, and Jason, it was a rare chance to get out for a weekend in a city that was just gaining popularity. They were all in their final years, looking for work options, and saw these days as something like a test of adulthood. The house they rented stood slightly off the main street and was quite ordinary from the outside. 2 floors, standard windows, and a low fence around a small courtyard. But as soon as they got inside, the guys noticed that something was unusual. The first thing that caught my eye was the strange silence. Despite the fact that there were a lot of houses around the street, it seemed to cars and passers-by as if they did not exist. The house seemed to stand apart, muffling sounds. Even when someone was laughing loudly in the living room, the voice seemed to sink into the walls. The walls of the room they were staying in were covered with old yellow wallpaper with blurred spots from time. 3 old-fashioned ceiling lamps provided dimmed light, making the room seem more cramped than they really were. As Nicole walked down the hallway, she noticed that the floor creaked especially loudly under her feet in one place. At first, she attributed it to an old building, but when one of her friends went up to the second floor, the creaking was repeated, and she felt a slight alarm. She decided not to focus on this, considering that she was worried about an unusual house. By nightfall, the company had already unpacked their belongings and settled down in the living room to relax after a long journey. The next day, Jason, who decided to walk around the house, noticed a strange detail. The entire side of the building, hidden from the road, was covered with thickets of dry bushes, which seemed to have grown specially so that no one would look there. He came closer. Something in the air seemed sour and unpleasant to him, but he chose not to tell his friends about it, deciding that it was just some kind of mental noise. A couple of hours later, Nicole returned with groceries and saw a note on the refrigerator where someone wrote in illegible handwriting, "Please make sure that the door is always closed. He can come out." Nicole froze, feeling her heart pounding with sudden fear, but quickly copied the note to one of her friends, who decided to prank her. Thinking so, she took the note, crumpled it up, and threw it in the trash. However, when they sat down at the table in the evening, all the friends took turns asking each other if anyone had seen a strange note in the house. On the second day in the house, the situation began to turn from strange to ominous. Jason, who had not yet forgotten about the overgrowth and the strange smell, decided to conduct a small investigation at home. He noticed that there was a door under the stairs to the first floor, which none of his friends seemed to open. The door led to the basement, dark and damp, with a strong, musty smell. Jason slowly descended the creaking stairs and suddenly felt that the air had become sticky, as if something heavy was hanging in this atmosphere. He turned on the flashlight and began to look around the room. His gaze came across an old wooden table in the corner, covered with dust and a scattering of decomposed newspaper clippings. He held the flashlight closer and saw that on the front page of one of the newspapers it was written, "The body of a missing boy has been found. The city is shocked by the disclosure of the details." Jason felt a chill run down his spine and hurried back to the stairs. When he got up, he firmly closed the basement door behind him, as if he was trying to lock something frightening. When he returned upstairs, he told his friends that he had found the newspapers, but tried not to go into details so as not to scare them too much. However, the tension has already begun to build up. Nicole, noticing the change in his behavior, insisted that they all look around the house together. Her wariness increased when she found another note on the windowsill in her bedroom, written in a trembling hand, "They can hear us. Be careful with every step." On the third day, their presence in the house began to feel like a prolonged nightmare. At first, it manifested itself in small things. Things turned out to be out of place, and everyone swore that they had not touched anything. The sounds coming from the corridor at night might seem like a quiet creak, but they got louder each time. Laura, who suffers from insomnia, claimed that she saw a silhouette outside the window. She even checked the doors and windows. Everything was closed, but she couldn't get rid of the feeling that someone was watching them. Finally, when night had already descended on the city, the friends decided that it was worth talking to the hostess of the house and finding out if anything strange had happened here before. They called the number listed on the rental website, and after a few rings, they heard a tired female voice on the phone. Nicole plucked up the courage to ask if she knew anything about the history of the house. The woman on the other end of the line hesitated, as if choosing her words, and then said dryly, "Everything was in order in this house. If something seems unusual to you, maybe you just imagined it. This is a very old building, creaking floors, and noises are commonplace." But there was something tense in the hostess's voice, and Nicole couldn't shake the feeling that the woman wasn't telling her something. Before saying goodbye, she asked if they could leave the house ahead of schedule. There was silence on the phone, and then the woman answered briefly, "You have already paid the rent, so stay until the end of the term. It's okay, just ignore the oddities," she said, and hung up. Trying to control her panic, Nicole hurried back upstairs, but suddenly she was stopped by a sound, a barely audible moan, as if a muffled scream came from the other end of the basement. She turned on the flashlight again, and looking around, realized that the basement was much larger than it seemed at first. The light of the lantern picked out old shelves with books, drawers locked with rusty locks, and some bags wrapped in dark plastic, left over from the previous owners. Turning sharply, she saw that Jason was already standing behind her. He couldn't sleep either, and when he noticed that Nicole had left, he decided to follow her. When the two of them were exploring the basement, they heard footsteps. Their approaching friends came to find out what was going on. Laura held her hand on her chest, trying to calm her breathing, and Matt looked around nervously, realizing that the basement was just one of the reasons for concern. The four of them stood in a dense ring of light, surrounded by cold darkness. "There's something wrong here. I need to know what happened to the people who used to live here," Laura whispered, squeezing her shoulders. "I can't help thinking that they left this place for a reason." That same night, the friends still tried to ignore what was happening around them, but the tension became unbearable. Jason, being the bravest of them, decided to check out the backyard, confident that he could sort out something that was confusing them. He armed himself with a flashlight and went to the overgrown side of the house. Making his way through the dry bushes, he suddenly came across something solid and frozen in the ground. It turned out to be an old, rusted metal gate, leading to something that looked more like a narrow, dark passage. Realizing that there was nothing left to hide from his friends, he called the others. They joined him and, following Jason, entered this gloomy place. Descending the steps, they saw that it was not just a tunnel, but an abandoned, dilapidated room, the walls of which were covered with strange phrases. The chalk inscriptions read, "You can't stay here long. And do you hear their whispers?" Nicole felt a little dizzy when she noticed another note pinned to the wall. "Everyone who enters here leaves, but does not always come back the way they were before." She picked up the note, and suddenly a pile of dust fell from the ceiling, causing everyone to recoil to the side. The building seemed to literally radiate its anxiety, as if every corner, every room hid its own dark stories. Having no other choice, they returned to the house and decided to stick together. However, it soon became clear that something in the house seemed to be trying to separate them, targeting each one individually. Laura increasingly noticed that personal items were missing. She lost sneakers, chargers, and even a recently found pocket flashlight, which she left in her room. These little things were disappearing, making her feel out of place. The climax came when Nicole heard muffled voices in the hall at night. She got up and, barely daring to look out of the room, saw that the basement door was open again, and someone, judging by the sounds, had already gone downstairs. Having no time to think, she grabbed a flashlight and, feeling fear with every step, followed the voice. But when she reached the end of the stairs, she saw emptiness, and only the gloomy walls absorbing her gaze seemed alive. Matt said going back to the kitchen and looking for any recordings that might shed light on what was going on. So they did, leaving the basement behind them and closing the door tightly. They went into the kitchen, and Matt, remembering how owners often leave instructions and old papers in cupboards, opened one of the top drawers. There was a stack of papers, among which he noticed a yellowed notebook with the inscription, "Visitor's Log." They unfolded it, expecting to see standard entries like check-in dates or breakdown complaints, but came across something else. Names and dates marked with indistinct, as if trembling lines. In every second place, the name was crossed out, and next to it were dates indicating different times of residence, sometimes with long intervals. Some of the entries were barely readable, but one of them stood out in particular. The Miller family, only one has returned. Alone? Jason whispered, tracing the lines with his finger. Where did the others go? As Laura was flipping through the pages, a folded piece of paper fell out. She opened it and found another note. This house does not forget anyone. Watch out for the signs, otherwise it will stay in you forever. The next day, Nicole, realizing that staying here for at least one more night had become unbearable, insisted that everyone leave. But when they started packing, they realized that someone had broken into the back door, leaving deep scratches on the wood. There were some things lying around the threshold, as if someone had dropped them while running away. It was a battered book. It looked like an old photo album that they didn't dare touch. However, there were still black and white photographs inside. They depicted families who had lived here before, all of them standing in front of the house, as is customary for new settlers. And in every photo there is the same sign, a strange mark on the wall, barely noticeable, but repeating from frame to frame. Matt, holding the album in his hands, felt his stomach drop when he recognized one of the people in the picture. It was a man whom he had accidentally bumped into outside the house on the first evening. Then he had just walked by and seemed to have forgotten about him, but now this man seemed to be an important part of the whole mystery. The guys gathered at the door, and Jason suggested that everyone disperse for a while to find answers. He decided to go to the neighbors and ask them what they know about the house and its history. Nicole went to the basement, hoping to find any evidence there that would explain what was happening to them. While Nicole was scanning the dark basement, a large crack in the wall caught her attention. It seemed so deep that Nicole began to disassemble its edges, tearing off pieces of plaster as if trying to get to something. Behind a layer of plaster, she came across a wooden panel, which she opened with great effort. The panel led into a small room, so cramped that it could only fit one bed. There were prints of children's hands on the walls of the room, and Nicole realized that someone must have spent more than one day here. Back upstairs, she couldn't keep quiet. Her main task now was to find an explanation. Nicole, unable to contain her tension, shared what she saw with her friends, and soon they all returned to the basement to take another look at that sinister room. Their expectations were not destined to be fulfilled. In front of them again, there was only a dust-covered panel, and there was no trace of the room behind it now. Jason, despite the bewilderment of his friends, began to insist on calling the police or at least talking to the local authorities. That night, they couldn't sleep, each in turn listening to any sound in the house, waiting for another creak or groan in the walls to reveal another secret. In the morning, they gathered in the kitchen, deciding to discuss their next steps. The fear turned into a determination to find out the truth about the house and its former inhabitants. Jason, paying attention to the bulletin board in the city center, found a small museum where an old archivist worked, who probably knew more about the history of the area. They decided to go there to try to find information about mysterious disappearances and related places. The archivist, a sullen elderly man, listened to their story and, frowning, pointed to the archive folders lying on the table. "This house," he said, smoothing his gray hair, "has been abandoned for a long time. It was built on the site where there was once a shelter for troubled teenagers, and if you want to know, the disappearances began back then." The boys delved into old newspapers, photographs, and documents, looking for anything about the shelter that had once been demolished. The articles told about cruel educators, beatings, and mysterious missing children. The names that popped up in the recordings were familiar. "We were like trash to them." Thomas's voice trembled. but his gaze remained steady. We were locked in the basement for any offense. Those who tried to escape were severely punished. None of us knew what was going on upstairs until one day one of the boys disappeared, and that was the beginning of the end. Thomas explained that caregivers used children as cheap labor, forcing them to work inside and outside the house, in warehouses and farms. Some children simply could not stand it, and then they were locked in the basement, deprived of food and water for several days. Those who couldn't stand it disappeared without a trace. When the house was closed, those children who remained were sent to other shelters, and the building was quickly sold. Nicole and her friends listened to Thomas in utter horror, realizing that every creak, every detail they had noticed over the past few days. All this was part of the traces of those terrible events that once happened here. Thomas finished his story by getting up from his chair. This house is a trap for memories, and it left a mark on everyone who came here. He finished and, without waiting for an answer, went out the door. There was silence in the house. Nicole, Jason, Matt, and Laura, without speaking, began to pack their things. They soon left the house, relieved that their stay here had come to an end. As they drove past the house, they noticed Thomas standing on the sidewalk, looking at the old building with bitterness and pain in his eyes. It's all over with that day. None of them returned to the area anymore, and did not try to find out what had become of the house. But everyone always had memories of those terrible days and nights when reality turned into an endless nightmare. Many years have passed, but every time someone recalled this story, their heart began to beat faster. This house has always remained a symbol of pain, hopelessness, and the fact that some secrets must remain forever forgotten.